Greetings everybody. In this video we're going to talk about filing status. Let's hit it. Greetings everybody, and in this video we've got one learning objective, and that's going to be determining filing status. 5 filing statuses: married filing joint, married filing separate, qualifying surviving spouse, single, head of household. Married filing joint must be married on the last day of the year. If one spouse dies, the surviving spouse is considered to be married throughout the end of the year. Yeah, generally, the IRS doesn't see that death is kind of people usually don't die to avoid taxes. Sorry if that joke falls flat. But the fact of the matter is that and actually, I had this happen to a client of mine once. And what happened is that, actually it was funny in this sense, that they had died during March of 2020. So the first thing I thought when she called me up and said, yeah, my husband passed away, I thought, oh my God, did he get COVID? And she's like, no, actually COVID wasn't what killed him this year. It was the fact that he slipped and fell and fell off a ladder and ended up killing himself, which is why, be careful with ladders. It can be very dangerous. You want to note that, even though he had died in March, that throughout the entire 2020 tax year, she was considered married. And if you have a situation like that, and again, look, setting aside the emotional issues dealing with death, again, one of the things that our clients demand from us is that we're the rational ones. We're the ones trying to get them to do things that save them money on their tax return. That's usually why they want to hire an accountant to do this stuff. She reached out to me after he had passed. I think it had been like 2 months. So it was like May. And I said, look, we need to talk. What are your plans? And I asked questions, and we were able to kind of set up a plan for her to take the most benefit out of the fact that she's like, look, I can't live in the house anymore. I want to sell the house. I said, good, do it by the end of the year. And then we can get you to where you can still qualify for the $500,000 exclusion. The fact that your husband died, 1/2 of this goes to fair market value. So that's going to save you even more money. There's a whole lot of things that we ended up having to do. Now I've had other times where clients have died and they've called me literally before the client, the taxpayer died. The wife called me up and said, what do I need to do? And I said, I looked at the file. I said, there's nothing else we need to do on our end. Spend as much time with them as you can so that you can enjoy the benefit of that. She did. Came back to me. I waited a month before reaching out to her. She did invite me to the funeral, so I was there. Offer my condolences. We don't talk about taxes at the funeral. The only reason why tax even got brought up is because when she was introducing me to everybody who had no clue who I was, they're like, "This is Kevin. He's my tax accountant." That's probably the most thing that ended up happening. And then once we get past that, we end up having that conversation about this is what we need to do going forward, blah blah, so on and so forth. All right. If you are married filing joint, you are joint and severally liable for tax. What does that mean? So if you're married to somebody and you run up a tax bill and one of the spouses decides, I'm heading off to third world country that has no tax, extradition order, and you're here, you're stuck holding the bag for the whole kit and caboodle. Okay. Now, in cases like that, you can file for what's called injured spouse. And you can request, hey, look, this is kind of what's gone on, IRS, and there's actually some filings that you can do. But from a legal perspective, you are joint and severally liable. Married filing separate. Taxpayers are married but file separate tax returns. Usually this is a very, very bad idea. And when I used to recommend this to clients, I would do it under two circumstances. Number one, if I would do it basically after we did a tax calculation, we ran the numbers and we said, okay, married filing joint's you're going to pay $10,000 in tax. Married filing separate, you're going to pay $8,000 in tax. Let's do married filing separate. Okay. And when you do that analysis, you have to do it at the federal level and you have to do it at the state level to make sure that you're not, inadvertently causing them, you may save them $500 at the federal, but maybe married filing, because the state level, the status has to usually equal the federal, and then you end up owing $1,500 more on the state level. You're not really done them a favor. Okay. It's usually a bad thing to do this. Now, the second reason that would cause me to suggest people do married filing separately is if somebody else is engaged in illegal activity. Now, you might say, wait a minute, you would have clients who are engaged in illegal activities? Normally, no. But as of the shooting of this video in 2023, I can't believe I'm saying this, marijuana is still a controlled substance under federal law. Okay. I know Biden was talking about doing stuff. I don't know if he actually executed it and just, did whatever he did. I know there's been talk about removing it from, making a controlled substance. But technically speaking, if you are caught selling marijuana, even though it's in a state that's perfectly made it legal, that technically is an illegal act and can cause all sorts of problems. Okay. The closest I came to this in my history, I had a client who sold marijuana paraphernalia. So it wasn't really marijuana, and the paraphernalia in and of itself was never technically illegal. So we didn't have to worry too much about that. But if he actually started going into selling weed, we probably would have had a completely different conversation than the one that we had. So that could be the case. But also, if you end up working for a client that one spouse is doing something that a little shady, might be better to do married filing separate in order to just cover especially if you're representing one of the clients and not both of them. And saying, look, I think this is dangerous for you. I think you don't want anything to do with this. Recommend married filing separate for that. Now that can get into what we like to call extra tax affairs, where you're not just worried about what the tax ramifications are. You're trying to legally protect your client, but at the same time, could also ruffle some feathers where, maybe the other spouse comes to you and says, hey, what are you telling my wife that she needs to stay separate from me? That can create psychological, social issues. So you need to be careful about that. Married individuals treated as unmarried. In other words, if there's an abandoned spouse, if they're married at the end of the year legally or is not legally separated, they don't file a joint tax return of the other spouse, and then they pay more than half of their own support. Points 1 through 3 are not hard to get. It's that last point that kills us. They must live apart for 6 months. Okay. Now you might say, Kevin, how does the IRS know? Well, I've always said that it's better to just tell the truth. It's usually the way we do things around here because, we've got this thing called ethics that we try to follow. But generally speaking, if my clients are separated as of June 30th, living in separate apartments, and they have kids, then we can get them to be treated as unmarried, and then we can get them head of household status. You can't do this in order to get them to have single status. You can only do this in order to get head of household status. Why? Because you have to maintain the cost of the household that serves as a principal abode for a qualifying child. It's got to be a qualifying child. Qualifying surviving spouse. It's available for 2 years following the year of the spouse's death. Surviving spouse does not qualify if he or she remarries during the 2-year period. Why do we care? Because think of it, if point two happens, they're married, filing joint again. They don't care. Okay, so I always find it fascinating that they're like, well, you can't be a qualifying widower if you remarry. I would have been like, oh, duh, should have had a V8. Surviving spouse must maintain a household for the dependent child. That is true. And in that case of the taxpayer who her husband had died, they didn't have any kids. So follow on years, single. That's all we could do for her. And it ended up working out well for her. She's single. That's an unmarried individual unless they qualify for head of household. Head of household, you have to be unmarried or considered unmarried at the end of the year. That's talked about that in that previous slide. Not a qualifying surviving spouse, and paid more than half the costs of a house upkeep, which requires that you have to have a qualifying person. What that qualifying person is just to cut to the chase, qualifying relative, qualifying child. You got one of those two, you're good. Okay. An exception is for the parents, and with the parents, let me talk about this qualifying child first, and we'll get into that. All right, so qualifying person, they got the qualifying child, the qualifying relative who is the taxpayer's mother or father. Parent need not live with the taxpayer. That's the exception that they're kind of talking about. Okay, you don't have to, again, when we're talking about this, must maintain must have lived in the taxpayer's home with a qualifying person for more than half the year. If it's a parent, that doesn't necessarily need to happen. Okay. So you can actually, I could be taking care of my father who's in Washington State and still qualify head of household if I was unmarried. It's fine. As long as I'm paying more than half of his support and he's related to me, I'm good to go. Okay. Qualifying person can only qualify one taxpayer for head of household filing status. It's true. Not a qualifying person if the dependent is under multiple support agreement. What that means is you get into a divorce situation where multiple people are providing support to the child, so for example, you get divorced and say that two people get divorced when they're having a hard time making ends meet. And so what ends up happening is that they said, look, we're going to have somebody else kick in here, and dad of the taxpayer kicks in required support in order to take care of the child. Or maybe the father is the one who's actually got the child living in their house. That is a multiple support agreement. And they're very unusual. You don't see them too often. But generally in a divorce proceeding, this is why when the client gets divorced, you want to see that divorce decree and the divorce condition document, and not looking at that before filing a tax return is what I would call malpractice. Okay. Qualifying person, a custodial parent, even if non-custodial parent claims person is dependent on a divorce decree. So, what do we mean by this? Well, say, for example, that taxpayer and spouse have one kid, and under the divorce decree, each one's going to be able to claim them once per year. So we sometimes call this the ping pong effect. So even years husband claims, odd years wife claims. The qualifying person is the qualifying person of the custodial parent, and that will be defined in the divorce decree. Child will live with mother. However, father pays 60% of the child's support by this much money per month. The qualifying person is the custodial parent, meaning that the mother gets to claim this, even though every other year daddy gets to put the child on the tax return. Okay. Qualifying relative who is not the taxpayer's parent. Person must have lived with the taxpayer for more than a year. Yeah, so the parents get that not living there exception, but this one they don't. Must qualify as a taxpayer's dependent. Must be related to the taxpayer through family relationship. If only related because they lived with the taxpayer for the full year. If related only because lived with the taxpayer for the entire year, not a qualifying person. Okay, that's not what it is. Okay, status filing example. Assume that the last year Rodney passed away. In the current year, Anita did not remarry but maintained a household for Braxton and Tara, her dependent children. Which of these circumstances would Anita's filing status be? Okay, she's married. Rodney died, and they got 2 kids. Qualifying surviving spouse for at least the next 2 years after, and that's the year after that. Now, what happens is in the year that Rodney passes, they are still considered married filing joint. But the year after that, so let's put some years on here. Rodney passes away in 2023. For 2023, Rodney and Anita will file a tax return married filing joint. Now you're going to be like, well, how can that happen? Rodney's dead. He can't sign it. What you'll do is on the tax return, you put deceased under him and get the date of the death. And then because it's a husband-wife situation, you don't have to file too much other paperwork. Generally speaking, you will also want to file a Form 1310 if you're claiming a refund and the person is not related. Not married to the person who died. Okay, that's a 1310 situation where you file that and get that done. But with married filing joint, you don't have to do that. So in 2023, married filing joint. 2024, qualifying widower. 2025, qualifying widower, assuming that Braxton and Tara are still qualifying children. Okay. Assume Rodney and Anita divorced last year. During the current year, Braxton lives with Anita, and Anita pays all the costs of maintaining the household for herself and Braxton. Under these circumstances, what is Anita's filing status for the current year? Number one, we didn't talk about this too much. When we're talking about whether you're married or single in a year of transition. The question is, what was your status as of December 31st? That's what matters. What's your status as of December 31st? And if, say for example, you're, you and your girlfriend / boyfriend, you guys decide after leaving college, you live together for a couple of months and you're like, I'm not sure. You live separate and then you realize you guys are so madly in love with each other, you got to get back together and you end up getting married, last week of December. Your status would be full year head of married filing joint. Doesn't matter that you had periods of time where you were separated because you didn't know if you really wanted to do this. Doesn't matter. Okay. In this case, they got divorced. So at the end of the year, they're divorced. They are separated. You cannot file them on a married status. You have to choose a single one, which is going to be your single or your head of household. Okay. So she has to do either single or head of household, but she's got kids. She's got Braxton. So she gets head of household status. Wow, it's like I know what I'm doing. All right, soon Sean, Rodney's brother, lived with the Halls, but Sean paid more than half the cost of maintaining a separate apartment that is the primary residence of his mother, Sharon, whose gross income is $1,500. Because Sean provided more than half of her support during the year, and because her only gross income was the $1,500, she qualifies as Sean's dependent, as a qualifying relative. In these circumstances, what is Sean's filing status? Sean's filing status should be that Sean's filing status, I would assume, if he's paying more than half the support of his mother, he better be able to pay more than half of his support. So Sean's filing status is that he should probably get head of household too, I would assume. Yeah, head of household. There we go. It's like I know what I'm doing. Sean paid more than half the cost. Sorry, guys. I've been studying for one of my securities tests. Every time I see a situation that looks too clear to me, I'm always like, yeah, there's a curveball here somewhere. I don't know. All right, so head household status. Sean paid more than half the cost to maintain a separate household. That is the principal place of the abode for his mother, and the mother qualifies as his dependent. Okay? Most of these questions are going to be pretty straightforward. Like if you see it on the test, it's going to be very, very straightforward, I would believe. Well, folks, that's all there is for this video on filing statuses. I want to say thank you very much for watching this video, and I look forward to seeing you guys in class.